أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها النبي إذا طلقتم النساء فطلقوهن لعدتهن وأحصوا العدة واتقوا الله ربكم لا تخرجوهن من بيوتهن ولا يخرجن إلا أن يأتين بفاحشة مبينة وتلك حدود الله ومن يتعدى حدود الله فقد ظلم نفسه لا تدري لعل الله يحدث بعد ذلك أمرا. صدق الله العظيم. We continue from where we left off yesterday. I'll begin with translating. Ya ayyuhan nabi, O Prophet, إذا طلقتم النساء, when you Muslims divorce women, فطلقوهن لعدتهن, then divorce them before their iddah, وأحصوا العدة, and count the iddah. واتقوا الله ربكم, and fear Allah your Lord. لا تخرجوهن من بيوتهن, don't turn them out of their houses. ولا يخرجن, nor should they go out themselves. إلا أن يأتين بفاحشة مبينة, except that they commit a manifest indecency. وتلك حدود الله, and these are the limits set by Allah. ومن يتعدى حدود الله فقد ظلم نفسه, and whoever transgresses the limit set by Allah, then he has oppressed himself. لا تدري لعل الله يحدث بعد ذلك أمرا, you know not that Allah may bring into existence a new situation after this. That's the translation. Now, in order to unpack the meanings of this verse, the themes mentioned in it, there are many different areas relating to nikah which we need to understand, and we touched on some of them yesterday. So what I want to do today is sort of order some of the information for those of you who are continuously following that we spoke about yesterday, and expand a little, and then we can continue with the discussion relating to this verse. So talaq then is usually translated as divorce. In Islam, talaq is when a man says words which lead to the severing of wedlock with his wife. And in order to understand talaq, we need to understand nikah, and that's why I touched upon the contractual agreement of nikah in yesterday's majlis. So when two people who are permissible for each other, one offers themselves and the other accepts in front of witnesses, then they become husband and wife. The mahr is wajib according to Hanafi fiqh. Now, and there's a minimum of 10 dirhams, which is 10 silver coins, and there's no maximum. And if it's not agreed to be given in advance, then it's given after the consummation of marriage, and it becomes her right and his obligation. There are implications. Once a person gets married, then the husband becomes responsible in Islam for the nafaqa and sukna, which means the costs and maintenance of the wife and her housing, her accommodation. He becomes responsible for this. So, and the conjugal responsibilities towards each other are also part of matrimonial rights. So it's the right of each that the other is there to fulfill their need in this respect in a permissible way. And there are etiquettes here, and there's the halal and haram as well. For example, it's not permissible for a couple to be intimate, to have intercourse during the menstrual cycle in Islam. This is a severe thing. It's not permissible by the clear definition of the Qur'an. Nor is it permissible for a couple to have intercourse when a woman has delivered a child and she is going through the period of nifas, the post-birth discharge, which can go on for up to 40 days. If it goes on beyond this, then it's known as istihada, blood which is because of illness. It's not considered to be a prohibiting factor. So a woman doesn't fast and she doesn't pray if she's menstruating or she's in the days of nifas, and he cannot have intercourse with her during these days. This is an area which all couples should be educated about in Islam, so that they're aware of the halal and haram. Now, so the contract of nikah, when it's performed with the conditions and it's done between two people who are permissible for each other, then they become husband and wife. And just as the nikah itself, which is a verbal agreement, and it's based on offer and acceptance and the consequences that they become husband and wife, similarly, if he utters the words of talaq, then the marriage is severed and broken. The marriage is severed and broken. Now, I'm going to go through this, inshallah, systematically, so that we can, inshallah, get some clarity on this. The words of talaq will either be sarih, meaning they will be explicit and clear, or they will be indirect, kinaya. Now, clear words of divorce always take effect when he says them to her, whatever the situation, in that if he says them to her in jest, it still takes effect, and he says them to her seriously, it still takes effect, and he's angry when he says them to her, it still takes effect. So this is a common thing. People often inquire, they say, oh, but he was angry, or he says, but I was angry. But the reality is that even in anger, a divorce is a divorce, unfortunate though that may be. It's not unlike many other situations. I mean, if I can use this example for clarity, if you accidentally kill somebody, it may be called manslaughter. You didn't intend to. And if somebody does this intentionally, it may be called murder. But unfortunately for the victim, the consequences are the same. Here, the victim is the marriage itself. That's the victim, and sometimes the children. So people ought to think before they speak. So, just as a simple word of acceptance means that a couple are now man and wife, when the conditions apply in front of witnesses, similarly, a simple word leads to talaq. And this is so important that this entire surah is named after talaq. And Allah Ta'ala opens this surah with these grand words: O Prophet, إِذَا طَلَّقْتُمُ النِّسَاءَ, when you, meaning the Muslims, it's plural here, when you Muslims divorce your wives. So, O Prophet, the Mufassirin say this means, O Prophet, say to them, O Muslims, when you divorce your wives. So we're being educated about how to do this, and this lets us understand easily that there's a proper way of doing it and there's an improper way of doing it. So now, let us understand, clear words of talaq take effect, and words of kinaya which could mean talaq, many of these take effect in context. In context. What that means is, if a couple are arguing and he says words to her which can mean talaq as well, and the context and his intention is understood by the context in these situations oftentimes, the context implies that he's implying divorce, then it may take effect. If you need clarity, then consult. Now, so there's two types, there's sari and there's kinaya. There's clear words of divorce and there's indirect words. Now, it's important to be honest. What happens is when people say something which could be interpreted, they need to be honest with themselves, because this is about deen, it's about permissibility. But the next point to understand is that in a nikah, there's a possibility of talaq happening 3 times. It can happen in one go or separately. But it's not allowed to give a talaq, more than one talaq in one go. It's not permissible to do this. So the proper way, if it has to be given, is that one is given at a time. Now let's go through this as well, this point as well. What is the ruling about talaq? Is it permissible or is it not permissible? Well, talaq is permissible, but it is abghadul halal. It is abghadul halal. Talaq, we learn this from the hadith, is halal, but it is the most disliked of all the halal that there is. It's been made permissible because of necessity. Sometimes there is khair in it for one or both of the couple. They separate. Sometimes it's in their best interest. But oftentimes this is not the case. So the Sharia has given us this option, which itself is rahmah in those situations. But it's not rahmah if it's misused. And it must never be used as a way of pressuring your partner and spouse, as a plaything. So when you take a wife on, when you marry your husband, it's done in Allah's name. The khutbah, masnoon, sunnah khutbah is recited, verses of the Qur'an are recited. We recall the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam relating to nikah. And in short, this important union is created through using the name of Allah in the name of Allah, according to the Sharia of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's a sacred bond, and it must be treated like that. And the consequence is, or the consequence should be, that before marriage, during marriage, after marriage, if there comes a situation that the marriage has to be broken, then this too should be treated with respect. And just as we ensure that we come in oftentimes to a masjid, it's a dini majlis, a majlis of nikah, the Qur'an is recited, the ahadith are recited, Allah's name is invoked, and the nikah contract takes place. Similarly, if the last option is reached and it comes to a situation where there has to be a divorce, then the talaq also should be done in line with the Qur'an and Sunnah. And in these verses, Allah Ta'ala is telling us some aspects of this. فَطَلِّقُوهُنَّ لِعِدَّتِهِنَّ. And so, what does this mean? So basically, the fuqaha divide talaq into three categories. This is a separate point. You've already learned that you can give a maximum of 3 talaqs, but how should they be given? There are 3 ways in which it can be given. There's what is known as talaqi ahsan, and there's what is known as talaqi hasan, and there's what's known as talaqi bid'ah. All 3 take effect. Talaqi ahsan is the best way to give talaq. Should it have to be given? Talaqi hasan is the second best way. It's good in line with the Sharia. It's not wrong or a sin, but it's not the best way either. It's the second best way. And talaqi bid'ah is called bid'ah because it's contrary to the Sunnah. It's a sin to give a talaq in this way. So which one is which? Talaqi ahsan is that a person divorces his wife in a tuhr. This is the time between 2 menstrual cycles, the time of purity, in which he has not had intercourse with her. You see, if he's had intercourse with her, she might not get to her next menstrual cycle. There's rahmah in this. Because when you are pregnant, you don't menstruate. So what happens now? Well, he might reflect for their own sake and for the sake of the child. So, at-tuhr, and there are other dimensions to this, but the point is, the talaqi ahsan, the best way of giving talaq, should it be given, must it be given, is in a tuhr. This is the time between 2 menstrual cycles, the time of purity in which he's not had intercourse with her. And this means he should check this. Sometimes some sisters find themselves emotionally, shall we say, irritable when they are menstruating. I'm not generalizing, but the hormonal changes in a woman mean that her temperament may be affected by her menstrual cycles. And at the same time, a man might not be getting the gratification he wants from her during these days. And then they fly off the handle because shaitan gets involved, the nafs gets involved. And then in that moment, he gives a talaq. And it's over, unfortunately. Now, if this happens, he's committed a sin. This is what all men need to know. Those who are married and those who will be married. That some types of talaq is a sin. This is why when I get an inquiry that somebody asks, they say, I've given my wife 3 talaqs in one session. And has it happened? I give them 2 answers, not 1. I answer their question and I give them another answer as well. I tell them 2 things. I say, yeah, it's happened and you're sinful as a consequence. And you need to do tawbah and istighfar. So you didn't do it the halal way. So talaqi ahsan is to give talaq during purity in which you've not been intimate. And then you leave her. In the sense that leaving her here means that you don't give her another talaq. That's it. Only 1 talaq is sufficient. This is talaqi ahsan. Some women insist on 3 because they think it's better, because they're angry with their husbands, so give me 3 talaqs. Sometimes family and relatives do this. And sometimes some people who are not pious, in the guise of religious leaders, will pressurize people as well. This has happened as well, and this happens as well. People will, if you're taken into a room in which you're surrounded by several people, and they are now asking you to divorce. So some of your in-laws are there, and some imam has been employed into the system, and he's been asked to participate in this gathering, and you're unawares, you're brought into this room, and people are standing over your head and saying, divorce your wife or else, sign this paper or else. So these things happen, unfortunately. And people insist on 3. But this is not talaq ahsan. The Sharia prefers that 1 is given. And for all the intents and purposes of talaq, if your objective is that she's free from him, or that's her objective, then it will be achieved by the passage of the iddah. Now what happens is, if 1 talaq is given in clear words, he says to her, I give you talaq, I divorce you, or he says, I give you talaq, then what happens is that she is now divorced from him, but he has the option of ruju'. And ruju' means he can take her back. He can take her back. And this means that he will then still have the option of 2 more, but she can remain his wife as long as he does ruju' before the iddah is over. Before the iddah is over. And the iddah will be 3 menstrual cycles for a woman who is menstruating. So he's given her talaq during the tohar. Now 1 menstrual cycle begins, which is 3 to 10 days in Hanafi fiqh. Then there's another tohar, and there's no maximum is 15 days. Then there's another 3 to 10 days. Every woman's patterns may be different. Then there's another tohar. So this is 2 tohars, and the bit in which he gave her the talaq. Then the 3rd menstrual cycle. As soon as the 3rd menstrual cycle is over, she's out of her iddah, and she's completely out of his marriage. She's free to get engaged to somebody else or remarry him, because he's given her 1 talaq. During the iddah he could have done ruju' and taken her back. Now if she's pregnant, then the iddah is the delivery of the child. Whether that happens the next day because she was already heavily pregnant, or whether it's months later, if he gives a talaq during her pregnancy. So this is talaq ahsan. Talaq hasan though is that he's insisting on giving her more than 1 talaq. So in 1 tohar, 1 time of purity between 2 periods, he gives her 1 talaq, and then the hairs passes by, and then in the next tohar he gives her a 2nd, and then in the 3rd one, if he wishes, he gives her a 3rd. So he gives her more than 1. This is talaq hasan. By the way, reminds me, and see, the Sahaba are special, and it's our good fortune that they made mistakes, because if they hadn't, we wouldn't have learnt so much. Allah Azza wa Jal in His wisdom made it such that Sahaba made certain mistakes so that the Ummah could learn from them, because the Sahaba were a school. It was a madrasa. There were students, and when a student makes a mistake and the teacher on the board, he makes the rectification, the whole class learns. For us, the whole Ummah was able to learn because Sahaba made certain mistakes. So this is rahmah from Allah. And so in the Qur'an, Allah Ta'ala brings the Sahaba out of Jahiliyyah, so they come into Islam, they become Sahaba, and then they are refined. And so keep this in mind. When we learn about the Sahaba making certain mistakes, we need to learn that this was meant to happen, and there's khair in it, and Allah Ta'ala forgave the Sahaba, as He mentions again and again in the Qur'an when He mentions the mistakes. So what happened is, Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, the son of Umar bin Khattab radiallahu anhu, was young, and he was married, and he became displeased with his wife. They had a disagreement, and he divorced her. And he did so during her menstrual cycle. And Umar radiallahu anhu, the father, he came to Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he said, Ya Rasulullah, my son Abdullah, he's divorced his wife during the hairs. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was displeased. He wasn't happy. And he told him to do ruju'. You see, he had the option of ruju' because he'd given her 1. So he took her back. And he said, Rasulullah said, let him take her back, let him do ruju', and then after the hairs is over, if he then wishes to divorce her, he can divorce her. In fact, some of the Mufassirin say that these verses of Surah Talaq, which we've just recited, were revealed in this context. You see, so we learn from this. So all those men who think they can do what they like, they need to review the situation. If you fear Allah, if we believe in Allah and the last day and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, if we believe in the Qur'an, then we ought to do as we're told, because it's not a joke. We're not free to do what we want. Tilka hududullah. These are the limits set by Allah. So this is talaq hasan. And the 3rd type of talaq is talaq bid'ah, which we see all the time, unfortunately. Talaq bid'ah is when a person gives more than 1 in 1 tuhr. More than 1 in 1 tuhr. Now, because of the explicit statement of the Qur'an, at-talaqu marratan, and then after this, the 3rd talaq, فَإِن طَلَّقَهَا مِن بَعْدُ فَلَا تَحِلُّ لَهُ حَتَّى تَنْكِحَ فَإِن طَلَّقَهَا فَلَا تَحِلُّ حَتَّى تَنْكِحَ زَوْجًا. So the clear verses of Surah Baqarah mention 2 talaqs and then the 3rd one. At-talaqu marratan, this section of the verse is referring to talaq the ones in which you can do ruju. And then later on in the verse, Allah Ta'ala mentions that if he then divorces her after this, then she won't be halal for him until she goes through another nikah, hatta tankiha zawjan ghayra. If she then happens to be divorced in that nikah, if she happens to be divorced, it's not correct to marry temporarily, then and she continues with her iddah is over, then this couple decide that they can get on and they did marry again, then they're allowed to. So basically 3 talaqs. Now whether they happen together, jumlatan wahida, or apart, is irrelevant. The clear definition of the Qur'an is that there are 3 talaqs, and that's the Hanafi position. So a person gives talaq more than once, and by the way, if you do ruju, you don't then automatically go back to 3 again. If you've given 1 talaq and do ruju, you only have 2 left. Then you have another a tif and talaq again, then you have 1 left. Subhanallah, it's quite shocking to see how many people are continuing to live together after talaq, because they've lived together, they've had children perhaps, and they see each other as husband and wife, and then they don't realize that those words which come from your tongue, it completely changes the situation. The rules change. Only because you know someone intimately doesn't mean that you can't give them a talaq and it won't take effect if you say the words. It will. People are surprised by this. You know, sometimes ignorance leads to surprise. Ignorance leads to surprise. Sometimes, you know, if you don't understand something, you'll reject the truth. You say, really? Is that possible? And this is why I say, if we were to see these verses in the Qur'an so clear, it'd be sufficient to open our eyes. So to give more than 1 talaq at once is talaq bid'ah, and it's also to give talaq during hez. That's not permissible either. So in other words, to give talaq in a way that's not permissible is talaq bid'ah, because it's not in line with the teachings of the Sunnah. That's why it's called bid'ah. It's not in line with the permissible method mentioned in the Sunnah, in the Sharia. So this is the 3rd type of talaq, and as I say, unfortunately, we see this frequently. Now, no matter how displeased you are, you know, there's a limit. What do you want to do? You know, do you want to, I mean, it's gross, isn't it? If you look at the emotional condition of a weak human being, when you are displeased with somebody, what do you want to do? Do you want to completely obliterate them? What's the word? Vaporize them? What do you want to do? Unfortunately, that's what couples seem to want to do. In some very unfortunate circumstances, when there's violence, we see this actually happening, where people want to make the other person disappear. So this kind of anger, it needs to be dealt with. If you're the kind of husband and man who is so angry with your wife that you want to do the worst damage you can to her, the most painful way, then we need some spiritual rectification. And on the same note, if you're the kind of woman who drives your husband around the corner, up the wall, to the extent that you insist, some weeks ago, this lady was inquiring, and there's so many cases, so the anonymity is there because there's so many such inquiries, but she's asking, did it happen? And then she tells her story that she was angry with her husband on something, and she was chasing him about the house. He was tired, he'd come back from work, he had to go back out, and she's pursuing him in every room of the house saying, give me talaq, give me talaq, give me talaq. And so he gave it to her eventually. He says, don't do this to me. So this is wrong as well. And by the way, this is the ashra of rahmah, and I ask Allah to forgive all of us, our brothers and sisters, the living and the dead. But you need to know this. In one hadith, which is quoted by Imam Abu Dawud, Imam Tirmidhi, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam said, ayyamam ra'atan. By the way, this is not for men to quote to their wives, because it won't help the situation. This is for women to understand. I'm saying this to my sisters, my mothers. I'm not saying this to the men. You don't go about with the ahadith as a stick to taunt your women. It will cause problems. It's not the way of hikmah. There's a context. أيما امرأة سألت زوجها الطلاق من غير بأس به لا حرام عليها رائحة الجنة أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. Whichever woman asks her husband for talaq without any problem with him, and you can translate this bihi, without any problem in him, the fragrance of Jannah is haram upon her. Now think about this. The ra'iha, the fragrance of Jannah, we learn from another hadith, وَإِنَّ رِيحَهَا لَتُوجَدُ مِن مَسِيرَةِ كَذَا وَكَذَا. You can smell Jannah from miles away. So if a hadith is saying that the fragrance of Jannah is haram, it means you won't even get close to Jannah. Meaning this is such an act of disobedience in the eyes of Allah that there's a serious warning here. So I'm saying again, this is not for brothers to start quoting this to their wives. Forgive them. Forgive your women for their weaknesses because you have your own. But I say to the sisters, and I plead with you, that don't be the misdaq of this hadith. Don't do what this hadith is saying. When there isn't a problem. When your husband is a perfectly decent man, and you're still asking him for talaq, don't do this. You made that commitment, both of you, to go into this marriage. It's for better or for worse. There are extreme situations in which talaq is the resolution. I tell you, there are so many situations in which people are not happier after talaq than they were before it. Sometimes a bad marriage is better than the absence of that marriage, for various reasons. There's a lot of khair in it sometimes which you can't see, and you see it afterwards. And sometimes it's because of the children. Sometimes it's because it keeps you away from haram. It's sad to say this, but sometimes people slip very quickly after marriage because they're used to having someone next to them in their bed, and then when they don't, and they search elsewhere, and they don't find the halal path. So there are so many things for us to understand. Time?
41.
So basically, I've gone over the 3 types of talaq here. Now, the other thing to understand is the iddah, which this ayah deals with. Iddah. What is iddah? I mentioned it yesterday. Iddah is the period of time during which a woman cannot propose or be proposed to legally in Islam, in explicit terms. No one can propose to her and say, I wish to marry you. And it's a time in which she is meant to stay in the marital home. And it's a time in which the husband is responsible for her maintenance and her accommodation. And the verse deals with this. So let's go through this. Let's retranslate the verse again, and we'll come to the section. Ya ayyuhan nabi, O Prophet, إِذَا طَلَّقْتُمُ النِّسَاء, when you Muslims divorce women, فَطَلِّقُوهُنَّ لِعِدَّتِهِنَّ, then divorce them before their iddah. Now, I mentioned this yesterday as well. The Mufassirin say, مِن قَبْلِ عِدَّتِهِنَّ. This means, when we learn from other qira'at as well, this means divorce them at a time before their haiz, their period, menstrual cycle, so that they can begin their iddah properly. Because what will happen, if you divorce them during their menstrual cycle, that one won't count because it won't be complete. And it's thalathata quru, which the fuqaha of the Ahnaf says 3 menstrual cycles. So if you divorce a woman during her menstrual cycle, part of that has already been lost, and you need 3 full cycles. So it'll be actually 3 more full cycles. You understand? So there's the one in which you divorced and you shouldn't have, then there's 3 more now that she has to wait for. What you've done is you've prolonged her iddah unnecessarily, and you've committed a sin by divorcing her during her haiz. You see? So this is the problem. So if you divorce her during the time of purity, the tuhar, the time between 2 periods, 2 menstrual cycles, then she'll go into her first haiz, second haiz, and third haiz, and she'll be free. So you've shortened the time a little. So you should time the talaq, if it has to be given, so that it's before a haiz. طَلِّقُهُنَّ لِعِدَّتِهِنَّ and وَأَحْصُوا الْعِدَّةِ. This is plural. And you should count the iddah. So this means men should be responsible too. So that if, the Mufassir mentioned this point, if you then wish to give her a second talaq, because you insist on giving her more than one, then you'll be giving that one at the right time as well. وَأَحْصُوا الْعِدَّةِ. So again, I reiterate, talaq should be given in a tuhar in which you've not had intercourse. وَأَحْصُوا الْعِدَّةِ. And then Allah Ta'ala says here, وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ رَبَّكُمْ, and fear Allah your Lord. And you'll be amazed to count the number of times Allah Ta'ala instructs us to have taqwa in this surah, in the context of marriage. And this is why we say, you can't do what you like. We don't have a free hand. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ رَبَّكُمْ. The Mufassirin say, this taqwa mentioned here, together with fearing Allah as we should, includes not giving talaq in the wrong way or at the wrong time. And it includes the next bit. It includes not turning them out of their houses during the iddah. لا تخرجوهن من بيوتهن. Don't turn them out of their houses. ولا يخرجن. Nor should they go out themselves. إلا أن يأتين بفاحشة مبينة. Except that they commit a manifest indecency. And this is saying that the iddah should be spent in the marital home. And the husbands and their families are not allowed to turn them out. You don't have a tiff and turn her out of the house. You can't do that. It's not permissible. And if this means that you are afraid of, slipping, because what happens is couples have tiffs and then they feel sorry for each other very quickly, and then they start approaching each other again. So if you've divorced her, especially if it's a talaq baina, which dissolves the marriage completely, which I haven't yet spoken about. Talaq baina is one in which the marriage is, you need to do nikah again. And most of the indirect words of divorce result in this. If unsure, if in doubt, then ask. So what happens is, now if there's a risk that they'll end up sleeping together, being intimate, even though they now have to do hijab from one another, then what should happen? What should happen is he should either stay somewhere else, or he should involve somebody else, a woman in the family, who can stay in that house as well, so that they can be kept apart, so that she can perhaps share the wife's room or stay in the house generally, so that there's no fitna between them. Now, this subject about the house is a separate one for another discussion. It might come up later here in our durus. Basically, this is a separate problem. Who owns the house? Now, in Islam, there are some clear rulings about this, and suffice to say for our purposes today, that husbands and wives should fear Allah when they use divorce to take ownership of something which isn't theirs Islamically. Should fear Allah. In the short term, it might seem very appealing where you can run a court case and take over the property. Is it yours to begin with? Is it permissible? Husbands and wives both need to question their intentions. Who's bought it? Who's paid for it? Is it joint ownership? Does it belong to one or the other? In Islam, a property isn't divided in half when couples divorce. They both have entitlements. And so, to make this legally legal, people have the option of giving up their legal right for their shari'i obligation. And that's the way you keep yourself halal. So, he shouldn't turn her out. This is part of this taqwa as well. And she shouldn't go out herself. Now, this raises a few questions. During iddah, what can a woman do and what can she not do? And inshallah we'll come to this in tomorrow's dars. But for now, I think we've done our time. May Allah accept what we said and forgive our shortcomings. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wa sallallahu ta'ala ala khayri khalqi sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Subhanallahi bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, wa ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.